Okay, so here's a question for you. Ever heard of a lawsuit that links mob bosses to a fight over farm equipment? I know it sounds like the setup to a really weird joke, but it's a real case. And it's an incredibly important one that pretty much changed the rules for everyone. We're talking about Klehr versus A.O. Smith.
So seriously, what do mobsters and farm equipment have in common? I promise you, this isn't the beginning of a bad joke. The real answer is, well, it's a fascinating and seriously powerful piece of the American legal system. And the answer is a law called RICO. Now, I bet you've heard of it, right? It's always in movies about gangsters. But this story takes that law in a totally different and honestly, really unexpected direction.
Okay, so what is civil RICO exactly? Let's dive into how this law, which was made for taking down mobsters, ended up in the hands of a farmer.
You know, when we hear RICO, we usually think of prosecutors going after criminals, right? But what most people don't know is that there's a civil version, and it's just as powerful. It basically lets regular people, like you and me, sue big organizations for long-term patterned wrongdoing. It gives them the same kind of legal firepower that's used against organized crime. It's a total game changer.
All right, so let's get to the case at the heart of all this. It's a farmer's lawsuit against a huge corporation. This is the story of Klehr versus A.O. Smith.
So on one side, you've got the Klehr family, farmers from Minnesota. And on the other side, A.O. Smith Corporation, a massive manufacturer. I mean, it's a classic David versus Goliath story, right? Just a regular family taking on this corporate giant.
But the Klehr's lawsuit hit a huge snag, and it all came down to a really tricky question about time. Let's call it the ticking clock problem.
Think about it. In a lawsuit where the harm happens over many, many years, when does the clock officially start ticking? You know, the deadline for filing the lawsuit, what lawyers call the statute of limitations. When does it begin? It sounds like a simple question, but the answer has massive consequences.
So the courts basically had to choose between two completely different ideas. The first one says, hey, the clock restarts with every single new harmful act. Now, this is great for the people suing, the plaintiffs, because it gives them a much longer time to file, sometimes forever. The other idea says, no way, the clock starts ticking the moment you first discover the harm. And that's usually better for the ones being sued, the defendants, because it sets a very clear final deadline. The entire case, literally the whole thing, boiled down to this one choice.
This disagreement was such a huge deal that it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. So, let's get into their decision and see how they ended up setting a brand new standard for the whole country.
And you have to understand, the Supreme Court's ruling here wasn't just about settling a fight between a farmer and a manufacturer. Oh no, this decision was going to send ripples across the entire legal system for decades.
So what did the Supreme Court actually decide? They ruled that for these civil RICO cases, the clock starts when a person discovers, or, and this is key, when they reasonably should have discovered, both their injury and the pattern of wrongdoing behind it. Basically, they sided with what's called the discovery rule. Okay, but why is one ruling so important? Well, it all comes down to this really important idea called legal precedent. See, when the Supreme Court makes a decision, it's not just for that one case. It becomes the rule book. Every lower court in the country has to follow it when they see a similar case. It doesn't just end one fight, it basically becomes the law of the land.
So, why should you and I care about this ruling today? Let's break down the real-world impact of this decision, because it goes way beyond the courtroom.
You have to realize, before this case, things were a mess. There was a ton of confusion. You'd have different courts in different parts of the country with completely opposite rules for when the clock started. What this ruling did was create one single, uniform standard for the whole nation. It brought some much-needed clarity to a pretty chaotic situation.
So what's the bottom line here? Well, having that one clear rule is huge, for sure. But it also means that people who have been harmed, the plaintiffs, have to act fast once they figure out what's going on. On the flip side, it also protects companies from having to fight off lawsuits about things that happened decades ago. You know, when evidence is gone and memories are fuzzy. It's all about striking that tricky but really necessary balance between holding corporations accountable and making sure the legal process is timely and fair.
When you boil it down, the Klehr case was really about the legal system trying to catch up with a complicated, real-world problem that took years to unfold. And that leaves us with a much bigger question to chew on, right? In a world that's changing faster than ever, what happens when the law just can't keep up?